Well, hello there, and thank you so much for joining us today on The Best of Both Worlds. Stay tuned because we have Paige Johnson with us today. Welcome back, and we are so excited to have Paige Johnson here. I have been trying to get Paige Johnson for years.
It has been years.
Yes, it has, and finally she's here. So let's get to know her just a little bit. Paige, tell us a little bit about how long you've been quilting with long arm machines.
Well, with long arm, it's been about 16 years, but I started prepping for this job when I was 7. I come from generations of quilters. I got my first long arm about 16 years ago, and I was doing freehand, just like you. I come from a freehand background. And I switched to a Statler in '06, and the sky's the limit.
Never look back.
I really have the best of both worlds.
And now you have a studio?
Yes, I have a studio. I quilt full-time for customers. We have 4 Statlers. We just started rentals. And I've added fabric, and so I have over 120 bolts of wide backing because I don't need to mess with the little stuff. I'm into long arms and big backs.
And you live in?
Eagan, Minnesota.
Minnesota.
I'm in the Twin Cities area.
Awesome.
And I also am doing classes out of my studio.
Wonderful. Well, I know that we're all excited about that, and we can look for you in shows, too, here and there.
Yes, I will be traveling with shows.
Yeah.
I teach long arm and free arm.
And both.
And Statler and long arm, yes.
Well, I am so impressed with what I have seen so far, and I know the viewers are going to be so excited to see this technique. And she has something new that she's calling semi-custom, and it just blows my mind. So you're going to show us how to do that right now.
Yes, I will.
Okay, let's get started.
I did start quilting as a freehander, and as a freehander, we would like to move across the quilt, sewing as much continuous as possible. And I'd like to do that again with the Statler. And I'm going to concentrate on finding areas where I can transfer from one segment of the quilt to another. Today we're working with a disappearing 9 patch, and what the first thing I'm going to do is to put a pattern into all of my squares. I'm going to start and click point to point across this quilt, using the seam intersections to transfer into a new area. You will notice that the blocks are 2 different sizes, and we can easily deal with that using point to point with freeze aspect. The pattern I'm using for the squares in this quilt is Flora, and it's a point-to-point pattern from Ann Bright. And you will notice down here under the pattern properties that my freeze aspect is on. What that means is if I click further apart, my pattern is going to become larger. I'm going to demonstrate that on my screen by using Alt+P, which draws from where I can draw. I'm going to put my grid snap on, and if I go 1 grid, I get that size. If I go 2, my pattern is larger. And that is the feature that I'm going to use on the quilt at this point. I'm going to delete what I have on the screen, and I'm going to go into point to point. I'm going to be clicking from the corners of each block, and as you can see, I'm going to be able to go all the way across this quilt, placing these patterns. I'm clicking on that seam intersection. The intersection allows me an area from where I can transfer from one pattern to another. Now I'm at the end of my row here, and I can't click anything further, but I want to continue my sequence. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit my center lower button, which says stop. It really means interrupt, because I can move to my next section and continue clicking, and I'm going to get the same result. I have the same pattern, and freeze aspect is still on. The machine, when it starts to sew this, will pause at that last area, and I can either set in my controller definitions to pull up that thread or to let it drag. To get out of this, I'm going to hold down my shift key while I hit exit. Now from my machine head, I can click the mode button 3 times. Statler's going to go over and take its first stitch. This will stitch continuously across the quilt. And I'm going to cut my thread, and I'm going to hit start or OK, and my machine's going to come down, and Statler's going to start the row going back. We're coming to the end of this section. And what I would do at home is I would just advance the quilt and continue down the quilt doing this point to point with the flower. But I really want to show you what I'm going to do next. So I'm going to stop, change my thread color, and let's make a new pattern to go in the logs between the flowers and the squares. The next section that I'm going to do is going to be these gray rectangles. And once again, I want to move continuously through this quilt. I'm going to be using the seam intersections as my transfer points to move to the next pattern. And what you'll notice here is that I come in at the bottom and I go out at the top. I'm coming in at the bottom and going out at the top. But the next section, I'm coming in at the top, going out at the bottom, coming in at the top, and going out at the bottom. And for that, I'm going to need 2 separate patterns. One that starts on the bottom and ends at the top, and one that starts on the top and ends at the bottom. I'd like to show you how I made these patterns. I'm going to make these patterns using all of the wonderful attributes of Creative Studio, and I want to make it to fit this particular quilt. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into View, and I'm going to change the grid size to 2 inches. That's because my little rectangle pieces are 2 by 4 inches. I'm going to create a boundary around that area. From my keyboard, I'm going to go Alt plus B, And I've got my grid snap on. That's what gives me that pink dot. I'm going to click on the seam intersections and give myself a boundary that is 2 by 4 inches. Now I'm going to change my grid once again, and I'm going to make it 1/2 of an inch. And I'm going to start to click lines on this grid. And I'm going to use, again, a drawing feature. Alt plus L will allow me to draw lines. I'm going to click on the grid. My grid snap is still on. If I want to stop that pattern and start another one, I merely right-click, and that completes that pattern. I'm going to do another pattern right next to it, and you will notice that I am clicking up and down because I want my pattern to sew that way. And it's also easier. My hand is already down here while I do that clicking. And I'd like to have, I'm going to move this screen over, I'd like to have 15 of these lines. I'm going to have to stop and count here soon. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Oh, I right-clicked, and that's what, if I right-click twice, it'll get me out of that feature. Easy enough to go back in, Alt plus L, and I can finish that. Now I have a series of lines, but I want to make a little arc here at the top that's going to fit. And for that, I can either use an arc pattern or I can make one. Alt plus A will give me an arc. I need to have my first point, my second point, and my third point. And once I hit my right-click twice, I will get out of it. So this is the pattern that I want to put on the ends of all these pieces. I'm going to save this pattern by highlighting it and exporting it. And this is going to make a CSQ pattern. That's not where I want to save it. It is important to remember where you save your patterns. I'm going to save that as an arc. And you'll notice that it came into my screen. I can delete what's on the screen. I can use this pattern and draw a point-to-point pattern on my screen with Alt plus P. My grid snap is still on, and I'm going to right-click in between. Oops, that didn't work. Do you know why? It's because I was going in the wrong direction when I clicked. I can delete that. I need to do Alt plus P going from left to right, and my pattern is always going to fall in as it is pictured in my pattern preview window. Okay, let's move over and get these last ones here. I'm going to move down, and moving in the opposite direction, right to left, my pattern is going to fall in upside down, because it always follows the direction in which you click. The same is true on your quilt as it is on the screen. Okay, so I have right-click again to end that. I've got a pattern that is obviously larger than the area I want to fit it in. I'm going to grab this whole pattern and move it over, and using the purple squares, I'm going to move it down until it fits where I want it, and then I'm going to move it in so that my lines are closer together. Now I still need to start down here and end up here, so I'm going to draw another arc, Alt plus A, and I'm going to go with my grid snap on, I'm now going to hit the E key on my keyboard, and now I have an end snap. So I can do a shallow arc, and if I don't like how that looks, I can go into gray handles, which is F12, and adjust that arc. Now that's a pretty good style arc. I'd like to use the same one at the end here. So I'm going to rubber stamp it, move it up here, go into F11, which is end snap. My end snap is on. I'm going to hit the G key on my keyboard. So now I have a pattern. It is not going to sew, however, so I want to change my sewing order. If I select this pattern down here and I right-click, I can order join. What that's going to do is it's going to take all the patterns that are snapped together and put them in an order that is sewable. Now this is not a point-to-point pattern yet because my endpoints are not on an even plane. I can fix that merely by moving one of these ends and snapping it to a grid. Now I've got a pattern that I can use as a point-to-point that starts on the bottom and ends on the top. Let's make sure that's snapped. I would like to have the reverse of this that will start on the top and end on the bottom. In order to do that, all I need to do is mirror this pattern. I can right-click and use the mirror pattern. To me, it looks like a little coffee bean. I'm going to click on that, and Statler has given me instructions. Statler wants me to click a point on the grid, and because I have my grid snap on, I'm going to click on a grid point. I'm going to come straight down. Now I have a pattern that is a mirror image of my first one. The thing is, it's still ending here. I can use that same trick. I can make a reverse of this pattern by merely reversing the start and end. So now I have my log pattern and a reverse of that log pattern. I'm going to save each one of these into my project. Okay, I'm going to add the patterns into my project. So I'm going to go into Add a Pattern. And I am going to need as many patterns as I need segments of my sequence. And I decided I was going to start off with my 9-patch log. I'm going to click on that and I'm going to select it. I'm then going to do the reverse, select it. I need another reverse. And I'm going to end my sequence with one of the original logs. So now I can be done with that. I have 4 patterns here. And what I want to do is to select them in the order that I want to sew them. This pattern is selected. It is blue. In order for me to add additional patterns to this sequence, I merely need to hold down my Control key. And then as I click on them, they turn blue and they are in my sequence. Now to go to the quilt, I just need to go into point to point and I can click this out on my quilt. My next sequence is going to be clicked out on the quilt and I want it to run as continuously as possible. I'm going to start here where I'm actually coming in at the top and then going to the bottom, coming from the bottom to the top, from the bottom to the top, and then from the top to the bottom again. I want to put my patterns into Statler on the screen in that order. I'm going to need 1 pattern for every time I want to use it in the sequence when I'm concatenating. I'm going to be concatenating a reverse, one of my regulars, a regular, and a reverse. Then I will start the sequence over again. So I'm going to need 4 patterns in this sequence, and as I click them out in concatenation, they will sew in that order. Okay, I'm starting to click, and I'm clicking right on those seam intersections. It's all going very nicely. Occasionally, because we are dealing with quilts and nothing is perfect, I have to make a decision of where on that seam I'm going to click. I try to go in the middle, like this seam is not exact, but I'm going to go in between where it would be. Statler's going to stitch that out for me. Now I'm going to start going backwards. I've already set my sequence, so I don't need to do that again. Just clicking, the patterns are going to fall in exactly in the way they're supposed to. Concatenating is by far one of my favorite things in quilting. I'm going to cut my thread, advance my quilt, and continue on.
Paige, that was so exciting. I mean, that is just completely blows my mind that you can do that and I can see why you have so many machines and can keep them all going. That's awesome.
You set them
just
up,
terrific.
And all you do is push a button.
That's amazing. So thank you so much for being here today. Will you come back?
Oh, most definitely.
I hope so. I hope so.
Yes.
So thank you for joining us today, and be sure to tune in next time.